The ground had not softened in 3 weeks, and Abigail Cooper was beginning to believe it never would. She stood at the edge of the small plot behind her cabin, the one Thomas had always called the kitchen garden, though it had never grown much more than turnips and a stubborn row of carrots that came up crooked every summer. The iron pickaxe she held had belonged to her husband, and it was too heavy for her by half, but she swung it anyway because there was no one else left to swing it. The frozen earth rang out like a struck bell each time the blade connected, and each time the ground gave back nothing. Just a white chip of frost, a shallow scar, and the same unyielding hardness that had been there the morning before and the morning before that. It was the winter of 1873, and the Wyoming Territory was not interested in grief. Abigail was 28 years old, and she had been a widow for 11 days. Thomas Cooper had gone out in a December blizzard to check on the cattle, the way he had done 100 times before, and he had simply not come back. They found him 2 days later when the storm broke, lying face down in a snowdrift not 50 yards from the fence line, as though the cold had simply reached up and taken him mid-stride. The doctor in Cutter's Fork, the nearest town, said it had probably been his heart. He had always had a weakness there, the doctor said, though he had never seen fit to mention it to Abigail before, and she had not known whether to feel anger or despair, so she had settled on both. The cattle were still alive. That was something. The 4 remaining animals stood in the lean-to that Thomas had built the previous spring, their breath rising in white plumes, their dark eyes watching her with a bovine patience she found both comforting and accusing. She had fed them this morning. She had melted snow for them in the big iron pot. And now she was here, in the bitter January cold, trying to break ground for Thomas's grave, because the preacher in town had told her that the church cemetery was full, and that she would need to make arrangements on her own property if she wanted him buried proper before spring. She swung the pickaxe again. Her shoulders screamed. Her fingers inside their wool gloves were so cold they had passed the point of pain and arrived somewhere distant and numb. The sky above her was white as bone, stretched flat and featureless across the mountains, and the wind came down off the peaks with a particular cruelty that seemed designed, that seemed almost personal. She had been out here for 2 hours. The hole was not yet 8 inches deep. She did not hear Jedediah Lockhart coming. That was the thing about him that she would remember later, in the warmth of a different season and a different life entirely. He moved through the world the way the mountains did, quietly and without apology, as though the land itself accommodated him rather than the other way around. She only became aware of him when a shadow fell across the frozen dirt beside her, long and broad-shouldered, and she looked up to find a man standing at the edge of the plot who was unlike any man she had seen in a long while. He was enormous. Not in the way of fat men or loud men, but in the way of things that grow in wild places without anyone telling them to stop. He stood perhaps 6'3", with shoulders that strained the seams of his heavy buffalo hide coat, and arms that, even layered under wool and leather, suggested the kind of musculature that comes from years of splitting timber and hauling elk carcasses down mountain slopes alone. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar, not from neglect but from the simple indifference of a man who spent more time in the wilderness than in towns with barbers. His jaw was heavy and sharp beneath a beard that was close-cropped but dark, and his eyes, when she met them, were the gray of winter river ice, clear and still and faintly unsettling in the way that very still things sometimes are. He was carrying a long-handled steel mattock over one shoulder as naturally as another man might carry a sack of flour. He looked at her, and then he looked at the shallow scratch in the frozen ground, and then he looked at the pickaxe in her hands, and his expression did not change. He did not offer her pity. He did not tilt his head with the practiced sorrow of a man performing sympathy. He simply reached out his free hand toward her, palm up, and said, "That tool will not do the work you need it to do. This one will." His voice was low and unhurried, roughened at the edges by wind and cold and the habit of silence. Abigail stared at him. She was aware, in a dim and exhausted way, that she probably looked terrible. Her brown hair had escaped its pins and was blowing across her face. Her cheeks were raw from the cold. Her dress, practical gray wool over a heavy underskirt, was dusted with chips of frozen earth. She had not slept properly in 11 days. She said, "Who are you?" "Jedediah Lockhart," he said. "I winter sometimes up on the ridge behind your property. I've been watching you out here for a while." She did not know quite how to feel about that. She said, "How long is a while?" "Since dawn," he said without embarrassment. "I wasn't sure if you wanted help. Then I decided you did, whether you wanted it or not." There was something so plainly honest in that, so free of pretense, that she felt the tight knot behind her sternum loosen slightly. She looked at the mattock he was offering. It had a wide, flat blade on one side and a heavy adze on the other, and the handle was long and straight and made of dense hickory. It was a serious implement for serious work. She looked at the pickaxe in her own hands. She had been swinging it for 2 hours and accomplished almost nothing. She handed it to him. He took it and leaned it against the fence post, then turned back to her plot of frozen ground. He set his feet wide apart, adjusted his grip on the mattock's handle, and swung. The difference was immediate and almost violent. Where the pickaxe had rung off the earth like a bell, the mattock bit. It broke the ground open, not just chipped it, and with 4 more deliberate, powerful swings, he had deepened the hole more than she had managed in 2 hours of effort. Abigail stood back and watched him work. She did not feel humiliated by it. She felt, strangely, something that she had not felt in 11 days, which was the sense that the world was not entirely composed of things she could not manage. He did not speak while he worked. He did not make conversation or ask her questions, or fill the silence with words the way some people did when they were uncomfortable. He simply worked, swing after measured swing, the mattock rising and falling with a rhythm that was almost meditative, and the frozen earth gave way before him with a reluctant, grinding submission. After a time, Abigail said, "You don't have to do the whole thing." He did not stop working. "I know," he said. She watched him for another moment. She said, "My husband died 11 days ago." "I know," he said again. "I heard it in town when I came down for supplies." She pulled her coat tighter and looked at the mountains behind the ridge. The peaks were white and distant and beautiful in the way that things are sometimes beautiful when they do not care about you at all. She said, "The preacher said the church plot is full." "That happens," Jedediah said. "Ground out here can't always keep up with what the winters take." It was an honest thing to say. She appreciated it more than condolences would have given her. She helped him after a while, not with the mattock but with the smaller tasks. She cleared away the loosened dirt with a wide wooden scoop. She steadied the stakes he drove at the corners to keep the measurements true. She brought him water from the well, still liquid because she kept a fire going under the pump housing, and he drank it without stopping his work and handed the cup back without comment. By midday, the grave was finished. 4 feet deep in that iron ground, 3 feet wide, 6 feet long, the edges clean and square. Jedediah Lockhart set down the mattock and stretched his back, a single long movement that made his spine crack like ice breaking, and he looked at what they had done together. Abigail stood beside the open grave and looked down into it. The dark earth at the bottom smelled of mineral coal and something ancient, and she thought about Thomas in the frozen coffin the carpenter in Cutter's Fork had made for $30 she could barely spare. She thought about his hands, which had been large and calloused, and which had never been particularly gentle, but which had been there, always there, for 7 years of marriage. She thought about the way the bed had felt this morning, empty and vast, like a territory she had never intended to cross alone. She did not cry in front of Jedediah Lockhart. She had cried every night for 11 days, alone in the cabin with the fire burning low, and she supposed she had used up whatever reserves of public tears she possessed. She said, quietly, "Thank you." He nodded once. He picked up both tools, the mattock and her pickaxe both, and carried them toward the woodshed as though it were the natural thing to do. She watched him, surprised. He set them inside the shed out of the weather, and then he came back and stood at a respectful distance, not too close, not far enough to be dismissive. He said, "You have cattle." "4 of them," she said. "Enough hay?" She hesitated. "I think so. Thomas laid in stores before the weather turned. I'm not entirely sure how to count how much they need per day against what I have left." He looked toward the lean-to. He said, "I can look at what you've got and tell you if it'll hold." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze steadily. There was nothing in his eyes that made her uncomfortable, no presumption, no expectation, just a level and serious attention that she realized, very rarely received from any man. She said, "All right." The hay in the lean-to, they discovered, was adequate but only barely. Thomas had stocked well, but the winter had been longer and harder than the previous year, and Abigail had been feeding the cattle more than necessary, out of guilt or grief or simple miscalculation. Jedediah walked through the lean-to with his head nearly brushing the low rafters, running his hands through the stacked bales, checking the bale count, looking at the cattle themselves with the practiced eye of a man who had spent years reading animals and wilderness alike. He said, "Cut it by 1/3 each feeding. They'll complain, but they won't suffer. They've got enough fat on them to make it to thaw if you're careful." Abigail wrote this down in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, the one she had been using to track all the things Thomas used to keep in his head. Jedediah watched her write and said nothing about it. She appreciated that too. When they came back out of the lean-to, the sky had shifted. The white flatness of morning had developed a greenish tinge at the western edge, the kind of color that men who knew the territory read as a coming storm. Jedediah looked at the sky for a long time. He said, "You should get inside." "I need to bring Thomas in from the carpenters," she said. "The burial is day after tomorrow. The preacher is coming out." "I'll fetch him," Jedediah said. Abigail blinked. She said, "That's not your responsibility." "No," he agreed, "but you can't drive that wagon to town and back alone in what's coming. The road from Cutter's Fork drops into the gulch, and if that storm catches you in the low ground, you'll freeze before you make it home." She looked at the sky. She was a practical woman. She had been practical her whole life, raised by a practical mother on a Kansas homestead that had demanded practicality or death. She knew when she was outmatched by circumstances. She said, "The carpenter's name is Hollies. He's on the main street just past the livery." Jedediah nodded. "I know Hollies." "The coffin is already paid for," she said. Her voice was even, but it cost her something to say it. He looked at her, not with pity, with that same level serious attention. He said, "I'll be back before dark." He took his horse, a big roan gelding that was tethered at the fence line, saddled it, and hitched her wagon to his horse rather than to her own aging mare, whose temperament in cold weather was uncertain at best. He moved with an efficiency that was remarkable, every action purposeful and unhurried, nothing wasted. Within 15 minutes he was heading down the road toward Cutter's Fork, and Abigail stood in the yard watching him go. She did not know what to make of him. She knew almost nothing about him. He had told her his name and that he wintered on the ridge, and she supposed that for now that was enough. She went inside and put a pot of beans on the fire to cook, because people who were doing hard things in cold weather needed to eat, and she suspected that when he came back he would be cold and hungry, and that it would be the right thing to do. The storm hit an hour after dark, and Jedediah Lockhart arrived 10 minutes before it did. She heard the wagon coming up the road and looked out through the frost-filmed window and saw the shape of him on the wagon seat with Thomas's coffin in the bed behind him, snow beginning to swirl around the lantern light. She went to the door and opened it. He pulled the wagon as close to the house as he could, left the coffin in the wagon bed where it would be cold but sheltered from the worst of the wind under the eaves of the woodshed he pulled alongside, and led the horse into the lean-to with the cattle. He came inside stamping snow from his boots. The storm was beginning in earnest, and the wind was already whining through the gaps in the cabin's log walls. He stood in the doorway for a moment, filling it, and then looked around the small, clean space of the cabin interior. She had the fire going high and the beans ready, with a pan of cornbread she had made that afternoon. He said, "That smells good." She said, "Sit down then." He sat at the table, which seemed to shrink when he settled at it. She served the beans and the cornbread and a cup of black coffee, and they ate together in the warm light of the fire. Outside, the storm announced itself fully, hurling itself against the walls and the roof with the kind of undignified fury that Wyoming winters specialized in. Inside, it was warm and quiet, and it smelled of wood smoke and beans. Abigail watched him eat across the table. He ate with careful manners, not fastidious but not rough either. The manners of a man who had been raised properly once, a long time ago, and who still remembered how. She said, "Have you been alone on that ridge all winter?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Don't you get lonely?" He considered this for a moment as though it were a serious question deserving a serious answer, which she supposed it was. He said, "I have been alone so long that I have stopped noticing the lack of company, but I notice it right now sitting here." She was not sure what to do with that. She looked at her beans. She said, "How long have you been in the territory?" 6 years, he said. "I came west from Ohio in '67. I intended to trap and trade and then go back east, but I kept not going back." "What kept you?" He looked up from his plate and met her eyes. He said, "This country. The size of it. In Ohio, everything is accounted for. Every piece of land belongs to someone. Out here you can still go 3 days without seeing another person, and that suits me." "It doesn't suit me," Abigail said without meaning to say it aloud. He looked at her steadily. He said, "I expect not." "I came here from Illinois," she said. "With Thomas 7 years ago. We had a plan. We were going to build something." She paused. "We built this," she said, looking at the walls of the cabin. "It's a good cabin. He was a careful builder, but he was going to plant an orchard this spring." "You can still plant an orchard," Jedediah said. She looked at him. "I don't know how to plant an orchard," she said. "I barely know how to manage 4 head of cattle." "Then you'll learn," he said. It was not dismissive. It was simply stated like a fact about the weather. She said, "That's a great deal easier to say than it is to do." "Yes," he agreed. "Most true things are." The storm raged all night. There was no question of Jedediah leaving. The visibility outside dropped to nothing within an hour of dark, and Abigail was not a foolish woman, and neither was he. She gave him the blankets from the chest at the foot of the bed, and he slept on the floor beside the fire, wrapped in buffalo hide and wool, as relaxed and apparently comfortable as a man sleeping in a feather bed. She lay in the bed in the next room and listened to the storm and the fire, and found, to her own surprise, that she slept. In the morning the storm had exhausted itself. The world outside was buried in new white, and the sky had returned to its sharp, pale blue clarity. Abigail rose first and built up the fire and put the coffee on, and Jedediah woke when the smell reached him, sitting up from his floor bed with his dark hair loose around his shoulders, and his eyes clear and immediately alert, the way animals wake in the wild, all at once and fully present. He helped her clear the path from the cabin to the lean-to, moving enormous quantities of snow with a wooden shovel as though it were a mild inconvenience. He fed and watered the cattle. He dug out the wagon where it had drifted in. The burial was the following morning. The preacher came on horseback from Cutter's Fork, a thin man named Reverend Cleary, who was better at sermons than at condolences but who managed adequately. Jedediah carried the coffin from the wagon to the grave without being asked, and he stood at the edge of the open plot during the brief service, his hat in his hands, his head bowed, as steady and solid as one of the pines on his ridge. Abigail did not cry during the service. She looked at the wooden box going into the dark, cold ground, and she thought, "Thomas, I will manage, because there is nothing else to do." She thought, "I am sorry you did not get your orchard." She thought, "I am sorry the winter was cruel to you when I was not there to see it." Afterward, when the preacher had gone, Jedediah filled in the grave. She stood and watched him, and when he was done, he tamped the earth down firmly and stood back. She had brought a cross that the carpenter Hollies had made at no charge, a simple pine cross with Thomas Cooper, and the years of his life carved into it by a careful hand. Jedediah drove it into the ground at the head of the grave with 3 strikes of a mallet, clean and level. He stepped back and she looked at it, this small marked place in the frozen ground behind the cabin, and she thought, this is real now. This is done. Jedediah stood beside her, not close enough to impose, not far enough to abandon. He was simply there, like a ridge of rock, like a tree in a clearing, like something that had no intention of going anywhere. She looked up at him and said, "Why are you still here?" He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Because you need someone to be." She looked away. She looked at the mountains. She swallowed something large and difficult in her throat. She said, "I can manage." "I know you can," he said. "That isn't why I'm staying." She turned back to him, and there was something in his gray eyes that she had not seen there before, or perhaps had not been ready to see. It was not pity. It was not the particular hungry interest she had sometimes seen in men's eyes when they looked at a woman alone. It was something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. She said, "Jedediah." He said, "Yes," she said, "I am a woman 11 days widowed standing at my husband's grave. You ought to know that I am not in any condition for anything." He nodded slowly. "I know it," he said. "I'm not asking anything of you. I'm just saying what I said." She believed him. She was not entirely sure why she believed him so readily, except that everything else he had said had been true, and she had no reason to suppose this was different. She said, "All right. You can stay for supper." He stayed for supper, and then he stayed for the next week, because the weather would not break and her cattle needed tending, and the woodpile needed splitting, and the chimney needed clearing of the ice that had blocked it, and she was, as she had honestly admitted to him that day, not entirely sure how to manage all of it alone. He slept on the floor by the fire every night, bundled in his buffalo robe, and she slept in the bed in the next room, and nothing passed between them that could not have been reported openly to the preacher and found unimpeachable. He was extraordinarily correct in that regard. She noticed it. She was grateful for it, and somewhere underneath the gratitude there was something else she was not ready to name. The days had a rhythm to them. She would rise first and make the coffee, and he would wake and tend the cattle and split wood while she made breakfast. They ate together. They worked through the day on the 1,000 small tasks of survival that a Wyoming winter generated in endless supply. In the evenings she sometimes read aloud, because she had a small collection of books that Thomas had carried west in a waterproofed box, and Jedediah would sit near the fire and listen with his big hands wrapped around his coffee cup and his eyes half closed. He was not a man who talked for the sake of talking, but when he spoke it was worth listening to, and she found herself listening carefully, noting things. He knew the mountains with an intimacy that was almost reverent. He knew which passes stayed open late into the season and which closed without warning. He knew where elk wintered and where the mountain lions denned, and where the best water ran even under heavy snow. He spoke of the wilderness, not with the bravado of a man performing his own adventure, but with the quiet familiarity of someone who had lived honestly inside it for years. She told him things too. She told him about Illinois, about the farm her father had worked until the land gave out, about her mother who had been iron-spined and brilliant, and who had died of a fever the year before Abigail married Thomas. She told him that she had wanted to be a schoolteacher once, before circumstances had narrowed her options, and that she still sometimes thought about it, on long winter evenings when the light was bad for sewing and the books called to her. He said, "There's a school in Cutter's Fork with no teacher." "Has been without one since September," she said. "Is that so?" He said, "It is." She thought about it. A schoolteacher was paid. It was not a fortune, but in a territory where fortunes were rare and honest work was everything, a teacher's wage was not nothing. And she had the land, Thomas's land, her land now, but land alone without a husband's labor was a grinding proposition. She said, "I'd have to go to town." "Yes," he said. She said, "I don't know the school board." He said, "I know the man who runs it. His name is Garrett. He's a reasonable person." She looked at him. She said, "Would you take me to speak with him?" He said, "Yes." 2 weeks after Thomas's burial, Abigail Cooper drove into Cutter's Fork with Jedediah Lockhart on the wagon seat beside her, and she sat down with the school board chairman, a stout and serious man named Roy Garrett, and she spoke with him for 40 minutes about her qualifications, her experience, her intentions. She had taught Sunday school in Illinois for 3 years. She had a secondary education that was better than most women in the territory and better than many of the men. She could do arithmetic through algebra, and she had a thorough command of geography and history, and could read and write in both English and tolerable French. Roy Garrett offered her the position before she had finished speaking. She started the following Monday. The schoolhouse was a low-roofed building that needed a new stove fitting and a fresh coat of whitewash on its interior walls and shelves of books that were 10 years old and missing their spines. But it had a schoolroom, and it had 22 children in Cutter's Fork and the surrounding ranches who needed teaching. And Abigail Cooper stood in front of them on that first Monday morning in February of 1873 and felt, for the first time in weeks, like herself. Jedediah came to the schoolhouse 3 days into the first week with a new cast-iron stove that he had apparently arranged to purchase from the hardware merchant as a donation to the school, carried it inside without ceremony, set it in the corner where the old cracked one had been, and connected it to the chimney fitting. He did this while the children watched with the frank, open-mouthed curiosity of children, everywhere observing something large being done by someone large, and then he touched the brim of his hat to Abigail, glanced at the children, and left. One of the older boys, a 13-year-old named Pete Haskell, said, "Is that your husband, Miss Cooper?" Abigail said, "No. That is a very helpful acquaintance of mine." Pete Haskell looked at the door through which Jedediah had gone and said, "He's the biggest man I ever saw." "He is rather large," Abigail agreed. She went home to the cabin that evening to find that Jedediah had repaired the loose section of fence on the north side of the property and had laid in enough split firewood to last 3 weeks, stacked neatly under the eave of the woodshed in a long, orderly row that was, frankly, beautiful. She stood looking at it in the late afternoon light and felt something move through her that she could not entirely categorize. It was not merely gratitude, which was simpler and sat higher in the chest. This was lower and warmer and more complicated. He had stayed on the ridge the past 3 nights, returning in the mornings to check on the cattle and do the heavier work, giving her the privacy of her own home, which she needed. But he was there. He was consistently there, and she had begun, without entirely deciding to rely on that consistency. February deepened. Cutter's Fork was a small town, and small towns notice things. She was aware of the talk. Mrs. Fremont at the general store asked, with the particular sweetness of a woman asking something pointed, "Is that Mr. Lockhart I see coming and going from your place, Mrs. Cooper?" And Abigail said, "Yes, he has been helping me with the property." And Mrs. Fremont made a sound that managed to communicate several things at once without containing any specific accusation. Abigail did not care about Mrs. Fremont's sounds. She had 22 children who needed teaching and 4 cattle who needed feeding and 100 acres of Wyoming territory that needed managing, and she was doing all 3, and she was going to keep doing all 3 regardless of what sounds Mrs. Fremont made. But the talk made her think. It made her think about what Jedediah was to her and what she was to him, and whether either of those things had names yet. She thought about it for a week. And then one evening in mid-February, when he came down from the ridge and they sat by the fire after supper, she looked at him across the room and said, "Jedediah, what do you want?" He looked up from the piece of leather he was mending. He said, "From life generally or from this conversation specifically?" "From this," she said. She gestured between them, a small economical gesture that she hoped communicated what she meant. He was quiet for a long time. He was a man who took his time with words, never using them carelessly or in haste, and she had learned to wait for him. He set the leather aside and looked at the fire for a while, and then he looked at her. He said, "I want to be useful to you, and I want to be near you, and I want both of those things to be because you want them and not because you need me to survive, because I think you'd survive either way, and I'd rather be wanted than needed." She felt the warmth of it move through her like a current. She said, "That is a very honest answer." He said, I don't know how to be anything else. She said, I'm not ready. He said, I know it. She said, but I am asking the question, which means I'm thinking about it. He said, I know that too. She looked at him, this enormous quiet man in her chair by her fire, his dark hair around his face and his gray eyes watching her with a patience that seemed bottomless, and she thought, where did you come from, Jedediah Lockhart, and why did you arrive at my fence line with a mattock and not a word of pity? She said, tell me about Ohio. He looked slightly surprised, which was rare for him. Then he settled back in the chair and told her about Ohio. About a farm in a river valley with his father and mother and 2 brothers. About the war, which he had been too young for by enough years to survive, though one of his brothers had not. About the restlessness that had taken him west after the war years, the sense that the country had broken something in itself that would take generations to repair, and that the mending would be loud and difficult, and that he would rather be somewhere large and quiet while it happened. She listened to all of it. She told him about Illinois in return, about things she had not told anyone in Wyoming, about her father's temper and her mother's grace, and the school books she had kept hidden under her mattress as a girl because her father thought education was wasted on women, and her mother had slipped them to her anyway. They talked until the fire burned low, and then he banked it for the night and wrapped himself in his buffalo robe, and she went to her room, and it was as simple and as complicated as that. March came, and with it the first suggestions of thaw. The creek that ran along the south edge of her property unfroze from the center out, the ice retreating from the moving water like a memory. The cattle grew restless in the lean-to, wanting the range, and Abigail let them out into the south pasture one morning to stand in the pale sunlight with their heads up and their breath making great clouds. Jedediah had moved, by the first week of March, from the ridge to the barn. He had asked her permission formally, and she had given it formally, and they had both understood that this was a step, and had made no more of it than that. He slept in the hayloft above the cattle, which he seemed to find perfectly adequate, and which Abigail suspected was more comfortable than his ridge camp had ever been. He began working the property in earnest as the ground softened. He repaired the barn roof where 3 boards had shifted over the winter and the gap had been admitting weather. He rebuilt the fence along the east pasture where the cattle had found a weakness, and exploited it with the patient persistence of cattle everywhere. He dug out the irrigation channel that Thomas had started and never finished, the one that would have run water from the creek to the garden plot, working with a long-handled spade in the cold mud of early thaw with a methodical determination that was, Abigail thought, beautiful to watch. She brought him lunch in the field. This was a thing she did not think about before she did it. She simply did it, carrying a wrapped cloth with bread and cheese and a canteen of water out to where he was working, and he stood up from the ditch and took it and ate without sitting down, looking at the creek and the property and the mountains with an expression she had come to recognize as his version of contentment. She stood beside him. The March sun was thin but real, and it was warm on the back of her neck in a way she had not felt since November. She said Thomas was going to put apple trees along the north fence. He said, good location for it. That slope gets afternoon sun in summer. She said, do you know anything about apple trees? He said, I know someone in Laramie who sells good stock. If we sent the order in the next 2 weeks, we'd have them in time for proper planting. She looked at him. She said, you planned that ahead. He looked back at her, and the ghost of something that might have been a smile moved across his face. He said, I have been thinking about your property for some time. She said, my property or me? He said, both, in equal measure. She felt heat in her face that had nothing to do with the thin March sun. She looked back at the mountains. She said, the school board wants me to continue through the end of June. Then they'll decide about next year. He said, are you going to continue? Yes, she said, and then, feeling something clarify inside her the way a sky clarifies after a storm, she said, Jedediah, I am going to stay on this property. I am going to plant Thomas's orchard and teach the children in Cutter's Fork and manage these cattle and make something of this land. I have decided." He looked at her. His gray eyes were serious and warm at once, which was something she had come to understand was the particular combination that meant he was paying his fullest attention. She said, "And I would very much like it if you were here." The quiet lasted for one long breath, two long breaths, and she was aware of the creek running and the cattle moving in the pasture and the wind coming off the mountains with its new March smell of pine and snowmelt. She was aware of all of it with a sharpness that she had not felt in months. He said, "How would you like me to be here?" She said, "Properly, if you're willing." He said, "Abigail." She said, "Yes." He said, "I have wanted to be here properly since the first morning. I have been trying not to push you before you were ready." She said, "I'm ready." He reached out then, slowly and with the deliberateness of a man doing something he intends to do right, and touched her face with one large rough hand. His thumb moved across her cheekbone, and she leaned into it slightly, the way a cold person leans toward fire. He bent down because he had to bend considerably to reach her, and he kissed her. It was not complicated. It was very simple and very serious, the way he was, and it was warm in the cold March air, and she put her hand against his chest and felt his heart beating under the buffalo hide and the wool and the muscle, steady and strong. When they separated, she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and she thought, "This is the second thing in my life that has surprised me entirely, and it is better than the first." He said, "I'll write to the man in Laramie about the apple trees." She laughed, which was the first real laugh she had produced in months, and it surprised them both. He looked startled, and then something opened in his face. Some tension she had not known was there releasing, and he smiled, a real smile, broad and unhurried, and it rearranged his whole face into something astonishing. She thought, "I am going to see that smile as often as I can manage." They were married in June. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Cleary in the small church in Cutter's Fork, and it was attended by most of the town, because a town that size had few enough events to celebrate and was prepared to celebrate this one thoroughly. Roy Garrett came with his wife and 3 children. The school children were there, all 22 of them, dressed in their best and only somewhat rumpled. Abigail's neighbor to the west, a Swedish woman named Britta Lindqvist, who had brought them dried venison in January, and who had become, slowly and quietly, something like a friend, stood beside Abigail during the ceremony. Abigail wore the blue dress she had been keeping in the cedar chest since her first wedding, the one that was the precise color of a winter sky when it goes clear after a storm. She had let it out at the waist, because 7 years and the hard life of the frontier had changed her somewhat from the girl who had worn it, and she had added white cuffs and collar from a piece of cotton she had bought at the general store, and the result was, she thought, quite good. Jedediah wore a good dark wool coat that had clearly been purchased recently and somewhat reluctantly from the tailor in Laramie, because it fit his enormous frame perfectly, and therefore could not possibly have been anything he already owned. He had trimmed his beard and tied his hair back with a leather cord, and he stood at the front of the church looking both completely himself and entirely incongruous in the small building, like one of his mountains had come inside. When Reverend Cleary pronounced them married and Jedediah kissed her, the 22 school children made a sound that rattled the window panes, and Roy Garrett laughed so hard he had to wipe his eyes. Afterward there was a celebration in the town square that lasted until dark, with fiddle music and tables of food that people had brought from their homes and farms, because that was how a frontier town marked occasions, collectively and without restraint. Jedediah danced, which surprised her. He was not graceful exactly, but he was confident and decisive, which in dancing as in most things proved adequate. He danced with her 3 times and with Britta Lindqvist once out of courtesy and declined all other invitations, which she found she did not mind at all. Walking home that night, the two of them together in the summer dark with the stars overhead in their impossible Wyoming abundance, Abigail tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and felt the solidity of him against her side and thought that this was what it felt like to have made a correct decision. He said, "The apple trees came in good," she said. "They did," he said. "We'll need to stake the two on the end. The soil is loose there," she said. "Jedediah." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you going to talk about the apple trees on our wedding night?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a tone that was different from the one he used for apple trees, "No, I don't suppose I am." She smiled in the dark. She said, "Good." The summer was long and generous and warm. Abigail taught school through June and then had July and August free, which she spent learning the property with the same determined thoroughness she had given to everything in her life. Jedediah taught her things. He taught her how to read cattle for illness before it became serious, the signs in the eyes and the coat and the gait that meant trouble coming. He taught her how to identify the mountain plants that were useful and the ones that were dangerous, walking her up the ridge above the cabin on clear afternoons and pointing out things by name as they went. He taught her how to shoot the Winchester rifle he had, because he said a woman alone in the territory needed to know how to handle it, and she learned quickly, which he said he had expected. She taught him things too. She taught him debentry bookkeeping, because his trapping and trading records were kept in a haphazard system that was barely intelligible, and proper records would make his dealings with the fur buyers considerably more profitable. She taught him something about how to talk to people, not that he was uncommunicative, but there was a certain register of social interaction that he avoided not because he was unfriendly, but because he had simply not practiced it, and she showed him how to navigate it without discomfort. He was a remarkably good student. She was not surprised. A man who had survived alone in the Wyoming wilderness for 6 years by paying careful attention to his surroundings did not struggle with learning new things. They were, she thought, genuinely good for each other. Not in the sentimental way of people who have never examined what good means, but in the practical, functional way of two very different natures that fit together along their edges without grinding. He was quiet and she was less quiet. He was cautious and she was bold. He was patient and she was determined. He knew the land and she knew people. Together they knew more than either of them alone, and the sum of it was something that worked. In September, when the aspen turned gold on the ridge and the first edges of autumn sharpened the air, Abigail realized she was pregnant. She told him on a Thursday evening, simply and without preamble, because she was not a woman for preamble when she had something real to say. She said, "I am expecting a child. I believe in March." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face in a sequence she could follow. Surprise, calculation of what this meant practically, and then something else, something lower and more fundamental, a warmth that rose up through all the layers of his reserve and reached the surface of his face openly, without his usual caution. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her against him very carefully, the way he handled all fragile things, which was to say with absolute care wrapped in absolute strength. He held her for a long time. She felt his chin on the top of her head and his arms around her and his heart beating under her ear. He said quietly into her hair, "I am very glad." She said into his chest, "I am too. I'm also somewhat terrified." He said, "That is reasonable." She said, "The nearest doctor is in Cutter's Fork." He said, "I'll make sure Dr. Marsh knows what's coming. Britta Lindqvist has delivered babies. I'll ask her to be on call." She said, "You've already been thinking about this." He said, "I have been thinking about the possibility of it since July." She leaned back to look at him. She said, "You could have mentioned that." He said, "You'd have told me when there was something to tell. You always do." She looked at him for a moment and then shook her head slowly, the way she sometimes did at things he said that were so entirely him that arguing with them was pointless. She said, "I suppose you're right. Autumn was beautiful that year." The territory put on a display of color that seemed excessive. The aspens blazing gold along the ridges, and the willows going amber along the creek, and the sky above all of it, a shade of blue so deep and clear it looked painted. Jedediah built a second room onto the cabin, working weekends and evenings when the school day was done, and Abigail was inside resting or preparing lessons. He built it from pine logs he cut himself on the ridge and hauled down on the sledge he had fitted to the big roan, and the room that resulted was solid and warm and smelled of fresh wood, with a window on the east side to catch the morning light. She watched him build it from the kitchen window sometimes while she was cooking, this large and serious man in his heavy work coat working with a precision that was almost gentle, fitting the log joints with a careful exactness that she recognized as the expression of something he would not say directly. The room was made the way he did everything that mattered to him, thoroughly and without compromise. The school board voted in October to continue her contract through the following year. Roy Garrett came to the cabin to tell her in person, which was not necessary but which she appreciated. He sat at her kitchen table and drank her coffee and said, "Those children have made more progress since February than they did in the 2 years before. We want to keep you as long as we can have you." She said she was expecting a child in March and that she might need to take some time away from teaching in the spring. Roy Garrett said, "We'll figure that out when we come to it. The position is yours, Mrs. Lockhart, Mrs. Lockhart." She was still not entirely used to the sound of it, and at the same time she found she liked it, which was a sensation she examined carefully and found to be honest. Jedediah came in from outside while Roy Garrett was still there, filling the doorway with his sighs and then moving to the fireplace to warm his hands. And he and Garrett spoke for a while about the territory and a new railroad spur that was being considered, and a dispute over water rights on the Eastern Range that was developing the slow, stubborn quality of things that would eventually require resolution. Jedediah's opinion on all of these matters was measured and well-reasoned, and Garrett listened to it with the attention of a man who has recognized, however belatedly, that the large, quiet person in the corner is worth listening to. After Garrett left, Jedediah said, "He is a decent man for a politician." Abigail said, "He is more of a school board chairman than a politician." Jedediah said, "In a town that size, the distinction is largely theoretical." She laughed, and he looked at her when she laughed the way he always did, with that slightly arrested expression, as though the sound of it still caught him off guard, even now, even months in, which she found she loved about him quite terribly. Winter came again, but this one was different from the one before. She was not alone in it. Jedediah was there every evening and every morning, banked into the life of the cabin and the property as though he had always been there, as though the winter of her widowhood had been the aberration, and this was the natural state of things. He was attentive to her pregnancy without being anxious about it, which she was grateful for, because the anxiety was already present enough in her own chest without his adding to it. He read to her in the evenings, which was a reversal of their early winter when she had read to him. He had a low, steady voice that was good for reading, even the difficult passages, the ones with long sentences that required breath control, and she liked lying on her side near the fire with her growing belly and listening to him work through a chapter of one of her books with the same careful attention he gave to everything. He had surprised her from the beginning, and he continued to surprise her, which she thought was probably the best thing you could say about a person you intended to spend your life with. Her son was born on the 14th of March, 1874, 14 months after Thomas Cooper had been buried in the ground behind the cabin, in the new room that Jedediah had built with the east-facing window that caught the morning light. He was born during a mild spring night, with Dr. Marsh present and Britta Lindqvist beside the bed, and Jedediah in the main room of the cabin doing what men were expected to do in such situations, which is to say waiting with a terrible stillness that was his version of visible anxiety. When Dr. Marsh came out and told him he had a son, Abigail heard the pause from the other room, that long-held breath, and then Jedediah's voice saying very quietly, "And Abigail," Dr. Marsh said, "Mrs. Lockhart is doing well. She is strong." Jedediah said, "I know she is." He came in when they let him, stooping through the doorway into the soft-lit room where Abigail lay propped against the pillows with the child in her arms. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, which groaned under him, and looked at the baby, and then at her. The baby was red-faced and determined-looking, with a dark fuzz of hair that might eventually be his father's color, and hands so small they seemed implausible. Jedediah reached out one enormous finger, and the baby's hand closed around it with a grip that was, for something so small, surprisingly determined. Jedediah looked at that small hand wrapped around his finger for a long time. He did not say anything. His face, which was normally unreadable in its reserve, was entirely readable in this moment, and what was on it was so large and unguarded and true that Abigail felt her eyes burn. She said, "I thought Daniel." He looked up at her. He said Daniel, and she heard him try the name, hear it settle. He said, "That is a good name." She said, "Daniel Jedediah Lockhart." He looked at her, and something crossed his face that she could not describe except to say that it was the most open thing she had ever seen on a human face. And she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he turned his face into her hand the way he always did. And they sat in the warm room with the new morning coming through the east window and the baby asleep between them, and it was complete. Spring opened the territory like a book. The apple trees along the north fence, 12 of them now, well staked and healthy, put out their first leaves in late April, a delicate green that was almost translucent in the afternoon light. The cattle went to range. The creek ran full and bright. The school reopened and Abigail returned to it in May, with Britta Lindqvist in a neighborly arrangement that they had negotiated that suited them both, watching Daniel in the mornings while Abigail taught. Jedediah had, by this point, mostly given up his trapping. He still went up to the ridge occasionally for a day or two, to check his old lines and to be in the high country, because she understood that he needed it the way she needed books, as a fundamental thing and not a luxury. But the fur trading had become secondary to the property. There was enough from her teaching wage and from the cattle to make things work, and he had taken on some work for the neighboring ranches, mending and building, and the kind of heavy skilled labor that a man of his capabilities could command a fair price for in a territory where such capability was scarce and useful. He was, she reflected, watching him from the kitchen window one June morning while Daniel slept in the cradle he had built, a man who had arrived without announcement and stayed without being asked to stay, and who had, in the process, become as fundamental to her life as the mountains were to the sky. She had loved Thomas Cooper, in the way of a young woman who married the first man she thought would make a solid partner, and it had been real and it had been good in its way, and she mourned him honestly and without guilt. But what she felt for Jedediah Lockhart was different in the way that depth is different from breadth, a different dimension altogether, something that had grown in the cold soil of grief and stubborn winter and hard work and honesty, and had come up as something entirely unexpected and entirely true. She went outside. Daniel was sleeping. The morning was warm and clear and smelled of grass and pine and the distant cold of the peaks. Jedediah was at the north fence, checking the apple tree stakes, crouching beside the smallest tree with his big hand around its slender trunk, assessing something. He did not hear her come up, which was unusual. She must have been quieter than she intended, or he was more absorbed than usual. She came up beside him and looked at the tree. It was small still, not much more than a branching stick, but it was alive and it had put out real leaves, and in a few years it would have fruit on it. She said Thomas would have been glad to see them. Jedediah looked up at her. He said, "Yes, I think so," she said. "He would have liked you." He considered this. He said, "Would he?" she said. "He was a practical man. He would have appreciated you for the same reasons I do." Jedediah stood up from his crouch and looked at her. He said, "What are the reasons you appreciate me?" she said. "You are honest and you are capable and you do not waste words, and you showed up at my fence line with the right tool at the right moment and you stayed." He said, "The staying was the easy part," she said. "It was not easy. It required courage." He said, "Everything worthwhile does." She looked at him in the June morning and felt full of something that did not have a simple name. She said, "Jedediah, are you happy?" He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at the cabin and the lean-to and the cattle in the south pasture, and the apple trees along the fence and the mountains above it all. He said, "I am happier than I knew how to be before you." She went up onto her toes and kissed him, there in the apple orchard that was barely yet an orchard, beside the fence line where he had first appeared out of the cold with a mattock on his shoulder and gray eyes and no pity, just the simple practical fact of help. He put his arms around her and lifted her slightly off the ground, the way he sometimes did, effortlessly, because he was enormous, and she had stopped being self-conscious about how small she felt against him and had started simply enjoying it. She thought, "I am going to be all right. I am already all right." The territory's summer was extravagant in its warmth. Daniel grew with the reckless speed of babies everywhere, from the red-faced creature of March to a round, squirming, interested person with his father's dark hair, and Abigail thought, her own eyes, which were brown and direct and people said missed nothing. He discovered his feet in July and was never content to stay where he was put from that point forward. He had opinions, expressed at volume, about everything. Jedediah was the most patient father she had ever seen. This did not entirely surprise her, given who he was, but the specific texture of his patience with Daniel was different from his patience with everything else. With the land and the weather and difficult tasks, his patience was the patience of a man who knew that time solved most things. With Daniel, his patience was something more active, more intent. He would sit on the floor with the baby for an hour, showing him things with the same serious, careful attention he showed to everything that mattered: a pinecone, a piece of smooth leather, his own large hands presented for Daniel's examination. Daniel examined everything with the gravity of a scientist, and Jedediah observed Daniel with the gravity of a man who has received something extraordinary and intends to be worthy of it. She watched them together and thought, "This is a good life." This is what the word means. In the autumn of 1874, a man arrived in Cutter's Fork who made things complicated for a brief time. His name was Caldwell, and he was a land speculator from Denver who had gotten wind of the territory's potential and was moving through the region making offers on properties. He came to Abigail's property with a partner and a paper full of numbers and the practiced charm of a man accustomed to dealing with women he assumed were easily managed. He told Abigail that her 100 acres, with the water access and the south-facing slope and the road access, were worth considerably more than she was getting out of them, and that he was prepared to offer her a fair price, and that a woman in her situation, alone with a child, would find the money very useful. She was not alone with a child. She was with her husband, who was in the barn when Caldwell arrived, and who came out when he heard voices, wiping his hands on a cloth, and who stood behind Abigail when Caldwell was making his pitch in a way that was not threatening but simply absolute, 6 feet 3 inches of solid and attentive presence. Caldwell looked at Jedediah for a long moment and seemed to recalibrate several things about the situation simultaneously. Abigail told him, clearly and with perfect courtesy, that she had no interest in selling, that the property was hers and her husband's, and that they intended to develop it themselves, and that she appreciated his interest but that his time would be better spent elsewhere. Caldwell left. Jedediah watched him go down the road, and when the wagon was out of sight he said, "He will try again." Abigail said, "I know it." Jedediah said, "I'll talk to Roy Garrett about what's happening with the land speculation in the territory." "It is useful to know who these people are and who they work for," she said. "I already know who he works for. I asked Pete Haskell's father about him this morning before Caldwell came out. He is connected to a Denver real estate company that has been buying up water rights. If they get enough of them, they control the ranching." Jedediah looked at her. He said, "You already knew," she said. "I was fairly confident he would come, yes. Men like that always come eventually when a property has good water." He said, "And you already decided," she said. "I decided in January of 1873. This is my property. No one is taking it." He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her when she had done something that surprised him, with that arrested expression. Then he said, "I love you, Abigail." It was the first time he had said it in precisely those words. He had said it with actions and with attention and with patience and with the room he built and the apple trees and 100 other things, but not in those words. She heard them settle into the air between them, and she thought, yes, exactly that. She said, "I love you too, Jedediah." "Very much." He nodded once, as though this confirmed something he had been fairly confident of but needed confirmed. Then he said, "I'll go talk to Garrett tomorrow." She said, "We'll both go." He said, "Yes." Caldwell did not come back. Roy Garrett made his own inquiries and discovered that the land speculation concern was of questionable legality in several of its operations, and word spread through the territory with the speed that word does in sparsely populated places, and the company found its prospects in that part of Wyoming considerably diminished. The winter of 1874 was gentler than the one before, or perhaps they were simply better prepared for it. The cabin was warm and the wood was stacked high, and the cattle were fat going into it from a good summer of grazing. Daniel slept in the new room in the cradle Jedediah had built, and Jedediah and Abigail slept in the main room with the fire banked low, and the Wyoming winter howled at the walls and found them, this time, proof against it. In the evenings Jedediah worked on furniture. He had discovered, somewhere in the process of building the new room, that he was rather good at the finer aspects of woodworking, the joining and the fitting and the precise work that required attention to small things. He made Daniel a rocking horse from pine that was so perfectly executed that Abigail put off letting Daniel anywhere near it for months purely, because she did not want it damaged. He made her a bookcase for the books she had been stacking in an increasingly precarious arrangement on the windowsill, a tall and solid thing with good clean lines, and she touched its surfaces with both hands when he brought it inside and said, "Jedediah, this is beautiful." He looked at it with the critical eye of its maker. He said, "The top joint on the right side is slightly off." She said, "I cannot see it." He said, "It is there." She said, "Then it is a very well hidden imperfection." He said, "All imperfections eventually become visible." She looked at him. She said, "That sounds like something that applies to more than furniture." He met her eyes and said, "It does." "But some things are still worth making." She said, "Yes, they are." By the spring of 1875, the apple trees were a foot taller and the irrigation channel was finished, and the cattle had grown to 8 head and the school had 27 children. Abigail had also, in the preceding winter, begun writing down the territory's history as told to her by its older residents, visiting them on Saturday afternoons, and recording their accounts of the land and the people who had moved across it, the settlers and the trappers and the Shoshone and Arapaho people whose land all of it had originally been, and whose displacement she recorded with a careful and honest acknowledgment that she felt was owed, and that several people told her was unnecessary, and that she continued anyway, because if she was going to record the history, she was going to record it honestly or not at all. Jedediah accompanied her on some of these visits. He knew several of the old trappers and mountain men, men who had been in the territory since before the major settlement wave, and through him she was able to reach people she would not have found otherwise. They drove out on Saturday afternoons in the wagon, with Daniel wrapped in blankets in the wagon bed, and spent the afternoons with people who had long memories and long stories, and she wrote them down. She was going to make something of it eventually. A record. A book, perhaps. She did not know yet what shape it would take, but she knew it was worth doing. Summer of 1875 brought a moment that Abigail would later say was the moment she knew, completely and without reservation, that she was exactly where she should be. It was an August evening, the kind that Wyoming produces occasionally as though to compensate for its winters, warm and golden and slow, with the light coming off the mountains at an angle that turned everything amber. Jedediah had built a porch along the south side of the cabin that spring, not a large thing, just wide enough for 2 chairs and a view of the pasture and the mountains beyond, and they sat there in the evenings when the day's work was done, with Daniel between them on the boards, pursuing whatever investigation he had currently fixed upon, which that evening was a collection of pine cones that he was arranging and rearranging with the seriousness of a general planning a campaign. The cattle were dark shapes in the pasture. The creek caught the light. Above the ridge, the sky was going from gold to amber to the deep rose of a summer sunset, and the mountains stood in it as they always stood, indifferent and magnificent. Jedediah's hand was on the armrest of his chair, and her hand was on her chair's armrest, and after a while she moved her hand to cover his, which was twice the size of hers, and he turned his palm up and held her hand. And they sat like that while the light changed and Daniel rearranged his pine cones and said things to himself in the incomplete language of a 1-year-old that contained, she was sure, whole philosophies. She said, "I was not supposed to be happy." He said, "Who told you that?" She said, "No one told me. But when Thomas died and the ground was frozen and I had nothing I could break it with, I thought, well, this is just going to be endurance from here, just managing," he said. And instead, she looked at the mountains and the light and the cattle and the pine cones and the large warm hand around hers. She said, "Instead this." He squeezed her hand. He said, "I was coming down off the ridge for supplies and I saw you out there in the cold swinging a pickaxe at ground that was never going to give. And I thought that woman is going to hurt herself before she gets 8 inches deep." She laughed. She said, "You were right." He said, "I went back up to the ridge for the mattock and came back down. It took 20 minutes. I was not sure you would still be there." She said, "I wasn't going anywhere." He said, "I know that now." She said, "Did you know it then?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I suspected it. You had that look." She said, "What look?" He said, "The look of a person who is not going to stop, who is going to keep going until the thing is done or they are." She turned to look at him. The amber light was on his face, on his jaw and his dark hair and his gray eyes. She said, "That sounds familiar." He said, "It ought to," she said. "We are very much alike in some ways." He said, "And very different in others." She said, "That is what makes it work." He said, "That and the apple trees." She laughed again and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and Daniel looked up from his pine cones to observe his parents with dark eyes that were becoming more evaluating by the month, and then returned to his arrangements as though satisfied with what he had seen. October arrived with its gold and red, and the smell of wood smoke and coming cold, and Abigail discovered she was expecting again. She told Jedediah over supper with the same directness as before, and he had the same response as before, that sequence of surprise and calculation and then warmth rising through, though this time the warmth came faster because he had practice with it now. He said, "When?" She said, "April, I think." He said, "The school board will need to know." She said, "I'll tell Roy Garrett this week." He said, "Are you well?" She said, "Very well. Better than last time, actually, at this stage." He nodded. He said, "Then we'll manage." She said, "We always do." He looked at her across the table in the firelight, this woman who had been swinging a pickaxe at frozen ground when he first saw her, this woman who had taken a teaching position and built an irrigation channel and started an oral history of the territory and planted an orchard and was now carrying their second child and was telling him about it as calmly as she told him everything, directly and without drama and with her brown eyes level on his. He said, "Abigail." She said, "Yes." He said, "I would like to tell you something I have not told you in precisely these words." She said, "All right." He said, "The morning I saw you out there in the cold with that inadequate tool and that frozen ground, I had been alone for a very long time. Not in the way of having no people around me, in the way of not having anyone who was mine. I had made my peace with it, or I thought I had. And then I saw you and I thought, I do not know who she is, but she is not going to be all right out there alone, and I am going to help her. And I came down with the mattock, and then I stayed because I could not make myself leave. And that has been the truest thing I have ever done." She had her hands flat on the table in front of her, and she looked at them for a moment, and then she looked at him. She said, "Jedediah Lockhart, you are the most unexpected thing that has ever happened to me." He said, "Is that good?" She said, "It is the best thing." He got up from his side of the table and came around to her side, and he knelt down beside her chair so that they were at eye level, which for him in this position required some significant folding of his large frame, and he took her hands in his, both of them covering them entirely. He said, "I love you. I want you to know it precisely." She said, "I know it. I have known it since March." She thought about it. "Since January, maybe, since you stayed." He said, "I knew it before I knocked on your door the first morning. I knew it when I came back up the ridge for the mattock. I just didn't have the right to say it." She said, "You have every right now." He said, "Yes." She put her forehead against his, and they stayed like that in the firelight while outside the October wind moved through the aspens on the ridge, and the cattle settled in the lean-to, and the apple trees stood bare and patient along the north fence, waiting out the winter the way everything in that country learned to wait, knowing the spring would come. Their daughter was born in April of 1876, as the first thaw was making the creek run fast, and the grass along the south pasture was beginning to return, a thin, hopeful green against the mud. They named her Clara Rose, and she arrived with a voice that suggested she had extensive opinions and intended to express them, which Jedediah said meant she would get along very well in the family. Daniel, who was 2 and intensely interested in the proceedings, examined his sister with the same evaluating gravity he brought to everything, and then seemed to decide she was acceptable. He brought her one of his pine cones, which he placed beside her with the precision of a gift-giver who understands value, and which Abigail kept, dried and preserved, in a small box with other small important things. The spring of 1876 was a good one. The apple trees bloomed for the first time, a white and fragrant profusion along the north fence that stopped Abigail in her tracks one morning in May when she came around the corner of the cabin and saw them. She stood and looked at them for a long time, the small trees that Jedediah had ordered from Laramie that they had planted in the cold April of 1873 that Thomas had planned and never seen. She thought, Thomas. They bloomed. She thought, I kept the land. I kept it and I grew it, and the orchard you planned is here. She thought, I hope wherever you are you can see it. And then she thought, I am happy, Thomas. I am truly happy. I hope that is something you would have wanted for me, because it is what I have, and I am grateful for every atom of it. She went back inside, and Jedediah was at the table with Clara in his arm and Daniel climbing his leg as though he were a tree, which he was permitting with complete equanimity, and Abigail stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the three of them in the morning light coming through the east window. She said, "The apple trees are blooming." Jedediah looked up. Something moved across his face. He said, "Come here." She crossed the room and he put his free arm around her, Daniel still ascending his leg, Clara making a small sound in the other arm, and he held her there. All four of them contained in the morning, in the warmth of the cabin, in the life they had made together out of frozen ground and an offered tool, and a stubborn refusal on both their parts to go anywhere. She thought, this is it. This is what a life is for. Outside, the apple trees continued to bloom, 12 small white torches along the fence line of 100 Wyoming acres. In the spring of 1876, in the Wyoming Territory, on the property of Abigail and Jedediah Lockhart, who had found each other in the winter cold and stayed. The years that followed were built the same way all good things are built, one season at a time, one solved problem at a time, one shared evening at a time. Jedediah took on a partnership with the blacksmith in Cutter's Fork, because the man needed a capable partner and Jedediah's skills ran broad, and the income from it was reliable and fair. Abigail continued to teach, becoming in time a person the town depended upon for more than the school, sought out for her clear thinking and her even judgment and her complete inability to be intimidated, qualities which the Wyoming Territory in 1877 and 1878 found useful with some frequency. Roy Garrett stepped down from the school board and was replaced by a woman named Eleanor Marsh, the doctor's wife, who was the first woman to hold the position and who Abigail backed publicly and without equivocation, which in Cutter's fork carried weight. The cattle grew to 12 and then to 15, and Jedediah hired a boy from the eastern ranches to help with the herd through the summers. A quiet and diligent 16-year-old named Samuel who slept in the barn above the hayloft the way Jedediah once had, and who learned the property with the same careful attention. Daniel at 4 was a boy of passionate interests and fierce competencies, already following his father around the property with a miniature set of tools that Jedediah had made for him and learning, with that same evaluating seriousness, everything he was shown. Clara at 2 was already, as predicted, a person of extravagant opinions and remarkable vocabulary, and she was, as her father had suspected she would be, difficult to argue with. Abigail's history project grew. She had filled 4 notebooks and was in correspondence with a man in Cheyenne who edited a territorial newspaper and who wanted to publish a series of her accounts. She wrote on winter evenings by the fire after the children were in bed, and Jedediah sat near her while she wrote, sometimes working on furniture or mending, sometimes simply reading, comfortable in the shared silence the way they had become comfortable in all things shared. She showed him her writing sometimes. He read it with care and said exactly what he thought, which was what she asked of him. He said once, "You write the way you talk, clear and honest and like you expect to be understood." She said, "Is that good?" He said, "It is the best kind of writing." She said, "You would say that because you prefer straight lines to ornamentation." He said, "I do, but it is also true." She kissed him on the cheek and took the pages back and kept writing. The apple trees produced their first significant fruit in the autumn of 1877. Not a large crop, 4 years old was still young for apple trees, but enough to fill a basket, enough to make applesauce and 2 apple pies, and a small quantity of dried rings that they kept in a jar on the kitchen shelf through the winter. Abigail tasted the first apple standing in the orchard on a September morning with Jedediah beside her, and she said, "Thomas would have been insufferably proud of these." Jedediah tasted one himself. He said, "They are very good apples." She said, "He had excellent taste in apple varieties." He said he had excellent taste in the location for them. She looked at him. She said, "You have been generous about Thomas." He said, "He was a good man who built a good cabin and loved a remarkable woman and died too soon. There is nothing to be generous about. Those are just the facts." She said, "Remarkable." He said, "Exceptional if you prefer." She said, "I prefer remarkable. I've worked for it." He said, "You have earned it entirely." She bit into the apple and they stood in the orchard in the September sun, and the mountains rose behind the ridge as they always did, and the creek ran in its cut below the south pasture, and the cattle moved in the field, and the cabin stood solid and warm and full of their children and their books and their particular life, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. On a January morning in 1879, the 6th anniversary of the morning Jedediah Lockhart had come down off his ridge with a mattock and found Abigail Cooper trying to break frozen ground alone. She woke before him and went to the window of their room and looked out at the winter world. It had snowed in the night, and everything was covered in the particular clean white that Wyoming wore in the mornings after fresh snow. The fence posts wore their caps of white. The apple trees, bare and patient, were outlined in it. The creek, she knew, was running below its ice skin. She thought about that morning 6 years ago, the cold and the grief and the weight of the pickaxe that was all wrong for the work. The shadow that fell across the frozen earth and the low voice that said, without pity, without presumption, "That tool will not do the work you need it to do." She had thought that morning that she was going to spend the rest of her life in survival mode, one foot in front of the other through an endless winter of managing and enduring and getting by. She had thought that what she was doing, alone at that frozen ground, was what life from now on would be, just the work, just the difficulty, just the getting through. She had been wrong. She had been wrong in the best possible way. She heard Jedediah wake behind her, that immediate and complete waking that was so characteristic of him. She turned. He was looking at her from the bed, his dark hair loose around his face, his gray eyes clear and attentive. She said, 6 years ago this morning. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I know it, she said. I never thanked you properly, not for that first morning. He sat up. He said, you gave me supper. She said, that was not thanks, that was decency. He said, come here. She came back to the bed and sat on the edge of it. He was warm and solid and real, and she put her hand against his face the way she had done in the frozen garden that first spring, and he turned into it. She said, Jedediah, thank you for coming down off your ridge. He said, thank you for not sending me away. She said, I nearly did. He said, I would have come back. She said, I know, that is why I didn't. He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the east window, the one he had put in the new room all those years ago to catch the morning, and it fell across them both, across the bed and the wool blankets and his large hands around hers. He said, are you happy? She said, I am completely happy. Are you? He said without hesitation, more than I know how to say. She said, you say it very well, actually, with everything you do. He said, then everything I do is the truth. From the next room, Daniel's voice rose in some declaration or negotiation with his sister, high and serious, and Clara's response came back immediate and unyielding, and they heard the sound of small feet on the floorboards. Abigail and Jedediah looked at each other. She saw the warmth in his gray eyes, open and unguarded and fully present. She felt her own heart full in her chest, full of the realness of it, the completeness of it, the extraordinary fact that the world had put a man with a mattock at her fence line in a January cold, and that he had handed her a better tool and stayed, and that from that one true moment all of this had grown. She said, shall we go make breakfast? He said, yes. They rose together into the winter morning, into the warm and living house that he had helped her keep, that they had filled with their children and their work and their particular love. And outside the apple trees stood in the snow along the north fence, waiting for spring as they would always wait, as all growing things in hard climates learn to do, patient and persistent and confident, in the end of the thaw.